Welcome to This Week in Creationism. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and we're going to be taking a tour of various creationist websites to see what's going on in the world of creation science. Before I begin, I thought maybe I should introduce the purpose of this particular series, since this is episode number one. I'm a longtime follower of creation science. Many of you know me from thenaturalhistorian.com, where I write about science and faith topics. And so I have an intense interest in young earth creationism, and I'm a regular follower of all the main creation science ministries, follow a number of people on Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. And so I have a good idea of what's happening in the world of young earth creationism. And so I thought I would do a weekly, and although I admit it's probably not going to end up being every single week, but a periodic update of what's happening in young earth creationism. That doesn't sound as good as This Week in Creationism, obviously. Um, and what I'll be doing during that time is simply looking at what's happening. I will have commentary on some things, but this isn't meant to be a here's everything that's wrong with young earth creationism or any kind of sarcastic approach. This is simply an informative, here's the world of young earth creationism, here's what's happening in it, my reflections upon what's happening in young earth creationism these days. And sometimes we'll take off on some particular topics that might be sort of hot topics in young earth creationism that I see being addressed by multiple different apologetics ministries. But mostly it's going to be just, hey, what have they talked about this week? What's on their mind, and what are they producing for their particular clientele? And to keep you up to date as to the major action and activities of young earth creationists. Okay, with that said, let's get started. Let's start with the Institute for Creation Research. Now, the Institute for Creation Research has been undergoing a little bit of an overhaul lately. They have a new president, Randy Gugliuzza, and he has recently written an article about their new commitment to deep research inside of their newsletter that they send out every month. And so on the front page of their website right now, you'll find a link to that particular newsletter. And if we dive into it a little bit, he calls it a new commitment to deep research. All right, deep research. And in here, he mentions that they're on a particular field trip or an expedition. They're probably taking video for a couple new videos they're producing. But he mentions two important things here in this article about their new commitment to deep research, and that is the two particular research projects that they're working on. And one is very close to his heart, and that's this thing here, a new engineered-based model called continuous environmental tracking, or CET. This is their option if you don't like the natural selection option. Institute, and I've talked about this elsewhere on my blog, that there's a rift, I'll say a disagreement between Creation Ministries International, Answers in Genesis, and Institute for Creation Research, which we're looking at here, about the efficacy of natural selection as a process that can help adapt organisms to their environment. Randy Guglielmo has been pushing for many years this idea of continuous environmental tracking, which is his, and he's an engineer by training. It's his idea of how organisms adapt and change their environment. They're simply turning on programs that were already sort of pre-installed in the organism, and it's their response. It's not that any kind of other force like natural selection, which he believes isn't a force at all, that can sculpt organisms. And so that's going to be, obviously, this is going to be a major push now that he's president of the Institute for Creation Research. He's going to be a major push for this deep research program. And so I expect that this is going to result in a growing divide between them and Answers in Genesis, which has very much taken up the natural selection is a thing, right? That God uses natural selection to adapt and create new species within a kind, of course, on this earth. The other project they're working on, it comes from Dr. Timothy Clary, who's their geologist, and he's been doing, well, as they call it here, borehole research. That just means he's looking at sediments across the whole world and trying to correlate them with the Genesis flood. And again, Institute for Creation Research has a real difference in their particular view of the flood geology column, or the layers of rock that were laid down by the global flood of Noah. And their particular view, almost all the rocks are laid down with the flood, and they have a very recent position. They place the flood and post-flood boundary as opposed to Answers in Genesis, which has a large segment of the top of the rock record being post-flood rock deposits. So here, just right here, right out in front, right on the front page, in his new commitment to deep research, both of his research ideas, or what he is going to direct the Institute for Creation Research to focus on, are both things that bring them into high contrast with the other two main creationist organizations. Okay, so let's move on to creation.com, which is the website of Creation Ministries International. And we see a few things that they've been talking about lately, like the pre-flood world resembled Pangea, okay, which again shows that they support this idea of tectonic plates and huge changes that occurred in the flood, and that the world before the flood looked like this Pangea thing, which is something that secular geologists talk about as happened 100 million years ago. They're also, and so their highlight article, at least for yesterday, was on human taste. And this human taste article is, and I'm not going to talk about the details of this. I'll give you the general summary. The general summary is, isn't taste amazing? If we couldn't taste things, we wouldn't be able to discriminate the things that we're eating that were good versus bad. And so, and then it goes a little bit into taste buds and how intricate the design of taste buds are. This is a very common article found on all three, or really any creation science apologetics website, and that is that they're trying to demonstrate the amazing design of nature, and therefore, because of this incredible design, it couldn't have evolved, and therefore God. I mean, that's essentially the argument. What I found interesting about this particular article on taste is talking about how amazing it is that there's particular genes, or in particular very specific proteins that interact with our environment and therefore allow us to taste and respond to our particular environment. There's no mention in this article at all of the fact that uh, our taste genome, all right, has thousands, well, hundreds and hundreds of genes that no longer function as taste. And the question is, what is our original ability to taste, and why do we have so many taste genes that are similar to other animals that none of us use? So there's nothing in here about sort of the original creation versus fallen nature and how did taste change over time and so forth. It's just a very simple message of taste is complex, therefore God must have done it. Um, and like I said, this is just a kind of you know, the, these are just articles you find all over the place. They're very easy to write, and typically written by non-experts, as I'll just briefly mention. So I looked up the author of this particular article, Lucian, and he has a graduate in applied physics in Netherlands. I couldn't find any evidence that he's actually a biologist of any sort, but he's of course interested in creation, and so takes topics and talks about them. And I wouldn't expect him to understand the intricate nature of the genome and genetics of taste, but the genetics of taste really belies a lot of the points that he makes in terms of really it's far more complex of a story than he tells. But once you get into the complex story, it then becomes harder to make the simple point that he wants to make. And that's typical for some of this literature. Again, I understand this literature is sort of very popular literature. It's just written for the average person who doesn't know anything about science. All right, so that's Creation Ministries International. Not a whole lot of, you know, uh, nothing really major going on there. And then we get to the granddaddy of Creation Ministries, and that is Answers in Genesis. They've got a couple banner articles. One of this is this one on dinosaurs. Did they shrink to become birds? And of course, they have a fascination with dinosaurs, talk about dinosaurs all the time. And this article links to this is a newly written article by Troy Lacey, who's just a staff scientist, science writer, who looks at articles that come out in the popular press or actually research articles, and then sort of like boils them down to like some message that could be made for the creation science audience. And here it really just comes, and Ken Ham actually highlighted this on his Facebook and Twitter and talked about, again, making fun of secular scientists or conventional paleontologists for suggesting that somehow these huge dinosaurs could have shrunk down into tiny birds. And I read that original article, and of course that's not really the exact sentiment, of the article. And Answers in Genesis loves to use this figure. They use it over and over again, that somehow this is the image that they conjure up in their mind, or at least that they're trying to get their audience to have in their mind, that somehow dinosaurs just unzip themselves and this completely different organism pops out, right? Which doesn't fit into this narrative of how is a kind made? Kinds can't change one kind into another, and since kinds are so different, how could you like suddenly change into another kind? Had you really read that particular article that they referred to, this is not at all the type of change that is referred to in there or mentioned. Um, then another article on their front page is actually just a throwback, and a lot of the articles that come up on their front page or highlight are simply brought back from years ago. And so this one on ancient bacteria, can it survive millions of years, is I can't remember, it's from 2012 maybe, from Georgia Purdom. And in this particular article, it talks about resurrecting bacteria and how could you resurrect a million-year-old bacteria since DNA would have decayed by that time. And I completely agree. Even at, well, actually, it's hundreds of millions of years old, I think, was the claim. And Georgia Purdom, writing in when she did, even then she should have known that conventional paleontologists and geologists were very skeptical of this claim that had come out in the literature, that somebody had gone into a deep column and pulled out these preserved bacteria and then had resurrected them, saying that they had been, in stasis for, so long, and then brought them back to life. And everyone was really very skeptical of that claim originally, and really that claim is not considered to be true anymore. And I think that would have been the case even when Purdom wrote this particular article, um, highlighting how ridiculous it was to believe this. And now they've highlighted on their front page again, and really that article needs to be updated to recognize the popular and conventional understanding of that particular study. And so it gives a false impression that DNA and other things can survive that long, that easily, that a whole organism could be resurrected after 100 million years. Let's see what else we have here. If we scroll down the Answers in Genesis page and we see other things that they're doing, one thing I would note is that they've published a large number of articles on viruses. What were viruses in the original creation? Since all viruses couldn't, viruses had to be good originally. They couldn't have had any kind of nefarious intent at all. Not that viruses have intent, but they couldn't cause bad outcomes. And so trying to grapple with, like, how did a virus learn how to attack and kill other organisms after the fall? And then they have this article here, immunity and creation science, like how amazing your immune system is. But then it raises the question of, like, well, what did the immune system do for Adam and Eve, right? If they couldn't die, um, and God was preserving them, how did they preserve them? Was their immune system the thing that preserved them? So somehow their immune system was really, really perfect. But does that mean things were actually trying to attack them and they needed to defend themselves from them? Or did the immune system have some completely different purpose in terms of, and they actually come down on the immune system as regulating their bodies and keeping the good bacteria in the right ratios or something like that in the original creation? What I think is interesting about the fact that I've seen multiple articles this way is, obviously this is a way of talking about coronavirus without directly talking about coronavirus, because they kind of don't want to talk about coronavirus very much uh, because it's difficult to take a stand on a particular view of what we should be doing about coronavirus, and they don't want to offend different segments of their audience, I think. And so what they're doing is they're sort of around the edges talking about all the other things that are about viruses and immunity and so forth, and giving advice on those issues, and allowing people to draw their own conclusions, or trying to get their ideas across that way. And I would like to come back and do another show that just looks at that particular topic and then compare some of the creation science responses to coronavirus, because I think it's interesting to see the differences between these different organizations and how they're responding to how we should think about coronavirus. But let's move on. Let's move on to creation. Yeah, let's move on to Creation Research Society. Maybe a little bit lesser known group, but sort of in the background, there's this thing called the Creation Research Society. And on their front page, they've announced that they have moved their operations from one place in Arizona to Arizona Christian University has given them a home. So they have a research lab there now. And Creation Research Society is a large group of researchers. So these are really the creation scientists, not the apologists and people that promote stuff, but they're the ones that would claim that we're doing the research. We're the ones that are actually studying and trying to understand, and they publish a journal. That's their main purpose, is to be a society that then publishes journal articles that then other organizations can use. And so they're the intellectual input, I guess you could say, into creation science. Um, and they've got, and I will over time be, when they have new issues come out, we can go and look at some of those new issues. They have two main projects themselves. So in other words, they sponsor some research. So it's not just that others do research and publish it in their journal, but they have some active projects. One of them is in conjunction with Dr. Thomas at Institute for Creation Research, looking at, of course, osteo tissue, in other words, soft tissue in bone. So, right, that's a hot topic in creationism, is going out and finding soft tissue, trying to understand it better to make their apologetic argument that the world must be young because there are these soft tissues in dinosaur bones. And then the other topic, the other project they have is called the E-Kinds Project, with which Janet Leitner and a few others have been pushing. And the E-Kinds Project is an examination of kinds in natural diversification and speciation, right? As it says there. All right, so they're looking at what is a kind, what's a biblical kind, trying to define the boundaries of it. How would we define it? That's something that young Earth creationists have been criticized over and over and over for, is the inability to define the limits of kinds. And then understand how kinds, with how, well, in their mind, how variation and diversification occurs within those kinds. Like, how does speciation happen? And I mentioned before, aforementioned, some people think that natural selection and other general mechanisms of evolution can sculpt and change organisms and make new species within kinds, whereas Institute for Creation Research agrees that species can change over time, but don't believe they occur by what are typically evolutionary mechanisms, or described evolutionary mechanisms. And so this particular project is trying to grapple with that. But of course, Answers in Genesis has a similar focus, and then there are others outside of the main organizations like Todd Wood and others that also have a huge interest in understanding kinds and speciation, and may have somewhat different ideas about how this happens. So that's this shows you a little bit of the variation of research interest and scope of research within young Earth creationism to date. And that brings us to our so that's what's going on right now in the world of creationism. Um, there's a lot of other topics have, well, a lot of other interest in social issues and interactions of what we know about science and those topics. I'll cover those at a different time, but mostly I'm just trying to give you a snapshot right now of, like, right now this week, if you look at the main creationist apologetics ministries, what are they promoting to their audience as topics and things that they're up to right now? And that's where we're at right now. So thanks for joining me on this little cruise of creationism, young Earth creationism this week. I hope to see you in another week, and we'll find out what they're up to then. Thank you very much. Have a great day.